Let the official WrestleMania Review Series begin, and today I take a look at the mania that started it all, WrestleMania 1 from Madison Square Garden on March 31st, 1985. Now, I think it's important to provide proper historical backdrop and context to this event to help better paint a picture for many of you. Now, you'll hear the WWE refer to how big of a gamble this was for Vince McMahon, and Vince himself will say it was the huge gamble, the biggest gamble that he ever took in his life. And that is entirely true. I don't think there is any question to that. Beyond question, this was the biggest risk of all the different risks that Vince McMahon has taken over the years. Back in 1985, this was the single greatest risk that he had taken. Now, the reason that it was such a huge risk and such a huge gamble was because of a series of events that don't necessarily directly just tie into the amount of money he was going to have to spend in order to make this event happen, to be what he wanted it to be, this showcase of sports entertainment as opposed to the old way of doing professional wrestling. Now, mind you, this is a WWF at the time that is coming off of the heels of the whole incident between John Stossel and Dr. D. David Schultz late in 1984, where he bitch slapped John Stossel for trying to say that the wrestling business was fake. So you've got this kind of cloud hanging over the WWF. At a time in 84, Hulkamania is running wild. Vince is going national and international, trying to change the professional wrestling business model. And you've got this incident happens. Then you've also gotten the run up to WrestleMania a few days before Mania, actually. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T appear on the Richard Belzer show, and Hulk Hogan puts Richard Belzer in a front face lock, basically because Belzer dared him to, and eventually he choked the wind out of Richard Belzer. Belzer goes down like a limp noodle, or whatever you want to call it, hits the floor, busts his head open, and that created some bad publicity for the WWF. Another incident that was hanging over the heads of Vince McMahon and the WWF at the time. Two lawsuits that eventually would be settled later on. But you just throw that in to the whole mix of so many other things I'm going to talk about here in a moment, and you have to understand just how important it was to the WWF and its future for this event to succeed, especially with people really talking in the 80s about how fake professional wrestling was and trying to expose the business for what it was, and the John Stossel, Dr. D. David Schultz incident, and the Richard Belzer incident with Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. There was a lot on the line here, and I think a lot of times, frankly, more on the line than Vince McMahon and the WWE will ever let you truly know. They will tell you to a certain degree, but I don't think they'll tell you nearly just how much was on the line. They'll give you a vague idea, and that's about it. Now, when we're talking about WrestleMania and the whole concept and how it came to be, I think it's time that we put some proper historical context on this as well. Vince McMahon will sit there, and the WWE spin machine will try and sit there and tell you that this was his idea, this was his baby, this was his brainchild, which is not entirely true at all, as a matter of fact. Sometimes I think Vince McMahon's great genius is not his own ideas. It is coming to the table with somebody else's idea and taking it and making it his own and making it better. And that's part of the reason why professional wrestling is in a bad spot today by comparison to where it's been in the past, is because Vince really doesn't have that competition to take an idea from, steal their ideas pretty much, and take it, make it his, and make it better. When you look at the whole WrestleMania concept, let's not kid ourselves. There have been other attempts at wrestling super shows in the past, and the most notable one, besides Inoki Ali in '76, has to be Starrcade '83, which was the brainchild of Dusty Rhodes. This whole kind of concept of you bring everybody together for one big supercard, one big super show to kind of have that Super Bowl type of event. That's not the brainchild of Vincent Kennedy McMahon. That's the brainchild, of Virgil Reynolds, Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream. What Vince did was he took Dusty's idea of making a professional wrestling supercard and took it and made it his own by making it a sports entertainment spectacular, if you will. I always find it interesting when they talk about the naming of the show, and I know there's an old story that goes around from George Scott of talking about how Vince McMahon wanted to call it, among other things, the Colossal Tussle. And I think it was George Scott was sitting there in a Jim Barnett voice doing it. It's the Colossal Tussle, the Colossal Tussle, the Colossal Tussle, Vinceys. And eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and they realized that that was a bad idea. And Howard Finkel apparently said, well, you have the Beatles, Beatlemania, so why can't this be WrestleMania? And thank God that Howard Finkel was a sensible enough man to give it a simplistic yet, you know, great name, I guess you could say, and calling it WrestleMania. Keep it simple, stupid sometimes is the best way to look at it. And that's exactly what you're looking at here. Now, in the build up to WrestleMania 1, not only do you have the John Stossel 2020 incident, you have the Richard Belzer incident. You're on the flip side, you've got Vince McMahon really hitching his wagon to MTV and the Rock and Wrestling connection. And that was really the big catalyst that set the wheels in motion for this event, for WrestleMania 1. When you bring in a Cyndi Lauper, and that was a huge deal at the time to bring in somebody like a Cyndi Lauper. A comparison today might be bringing in a Lady Gaga or a Katy Perry, something along those lines. We could talk about Cyndi Lauper now, but Cyndi Lauper in 84, 85 was a big freaking deal. You had Captain Lou Albano appearing as her father in the Girls Just Want to Have Fun music video. You have MTV coming on board because of Cyndi Lauper's involvement. You get Roddy Piper, who had been brought in 83, and he's sitting there doing his own thing, getting himself nuclear over as a heel, doing Piper's Pit, smashing Superfly Jimmy Snuka over the head with a coconut. And then and you've got some of the events at Madison Square Garden where you've got freaking Captain Lou and Cyndi Lauper, and Roddy Piper takes Cyndi Lauper's gold record and smashes it over Captain Lou's head. You've got him running Dick Clark out of the ring. All of this stuff eventually sets up the War to Settle the Score, which was a joint venture by the WWF and MTV. And at that time, that was something that was huge for the company. Now, WWF had been doing a little bit with MTV before, like when Hogan won the belt, etc., etc. But this was really big. You had the War to Settle the Score, where the main event ultimately was going to be Roddy Piper versus Hulk Hogan. And this was a huge deal and a huge event. It was really that first taste of what professional wrestling was going to become, what the WWF was going to become, this sports entertainment spectacular, this sports entertainment standard where celebrities from the outside world were going to come in, and the whole business was about to change. And a lot of people didn't know how it was going to change or if that change was going to be good or not, but you knew it was going to change. And with MTV there, in part because of Cyndi Lauper's involvement in the whole rock and wrestling connection, MTV was a great natural partner at that time for the WWF, trying to expand their reach both nationally in the cable television market and frankly internationally, because MTV, back when they were music television, and not, as Roddy Piper said, music to vomit over. They were big, and they did a monster cable rating with this whole War to Settle the Score. I think it was like a 9 or a 10 cable rating, which was a huge rating then and still a big, big rating today. Just think about that. That's a monster number to draw. And of course, this is where when Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper start jumping Hulk Hogan, this is where you get the involvement of Mr. T to come into the mix. And now the table is set, and WrestleMania 1 is well underway. And this whole thing of Mr. T getting involved, I think as history plays out and the years go by, I think sometimes the impact, the meaning, and the significance of Mr. T being involved in WrestleMania 1 and WrestleMania 2 is very drastically undersold. Not only were you bringing in one of the hottest television stars at the time in the 80s in Mr. T, who was hot. He was white hot. There is no question about it. B.A. Baracus from the A-Team, he was the 80s as much as anybody else was. And now you're not only bringing him in, along with an individual like a Cyndi Lauper, you're bringing him in to main event this new event, this WrestleMania. in Madison Square Garden. This was a big freaking deal. And they were able to take the involvement of Mr. T and get all types of mainstream media attention because of it. Like I said, the Richard Belzer show is an example. They actually appeared on, I think it was the Today Show and maybe even Good Morning America, if I remember correctly. But I remember the Today Show for sure. You've got freaking Hulk Hogan and Mr. T appearing on Saturday Night Live on the day before WrestleMania 1. That's a big fucking deal that cannot be underestimated at that time. When Saturday Night Live was hot back in '85, like really hot, you've got Hulk Hogan and Mr. T making an appearance there. That's all types of mainstream publicity and press for the WWF. So now you get to WrestleMania 1. Now, for you as a wrestling fan, let's say, if you take the in-ring stuff very seriously, this is definitely not the show for you. I will just flat out say that. If you're looking for any 4-star matches or any 5-star classics, this card is definitely devoid of that. But that's not why this event matters. That's not why this is a great event. That is not why you go back and watch this event. You go back and you watch this event to understand how things came to be. You watch this event to get some historical perspective and context of what the business used to be and how it slowly evolved and changed into what Vince McMahon made it be. In terms of some of the stuff on the card, though, you can even still see at this time where you clearly had with people like Vince McMahon and George Scott and Pat Patterson behind the scenes, you could clearly tell that they had a long-term vision on many of the things that they did. For example, you bring in a King Kong Bundy and you're going to have him beat SD Jones in 23 seconds. You're building up a monster with the thought process of having him main event against Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 2, which obviously is what happened with King Kong Bundy. You look at the initial match on the card. You had Tito Santana versus the Executioner, the first match of WrestleMania history. Who was the Executioner? Playboy Buddy Rose, of all people. But you put Tito Santana in that spot because you want him to go out there and warm up the crowd. You want him to get the crowd involved in the match. And that's exactly what he did. So he played his role perfectly. You have Ricky Steamboat versus Matt Bourne, which is probably, even though it was very short, was probably the best pure wrestling match on the card. But you're using this as a demonstration piece, as a showcase for a new talent that you just acquired in Ricky Steamboat. But as you look throughout this card, you really see where Vince McMahon's genius, like I said, is taking other people's ideas, other people's characters, other people's concepts, making them his own and making them better. And that's what you see all throughout this card. Now, some of the featured matches on here, obviously, were Leilani Kai versus Wendy Richter for the WWF Women's Championship. This is where you had Cyndi Lauper involved, and this was a big deal. The Rock and Wrestling connection being involved is a major reason why WrestleMania 1 could even happen to begin with, why they were getting all this mainstream publicity and press. Vince McMahon was a genius in terms of understanding that in order to grow his business, in order to really take over cable television for professional wrestling, to try and expand his reach and go internationally, he had to get new eyeballs on the product. He had to get a different type of eyeball on the product. And the involvement of somebody like a Cyndi Lauper and David Wolf, these type of things, that did it. Now you had your probably other matches of note here. You had the American Express of Wyndham and Rotunda lose their tag titles to Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik. And, again, when you set this against the backdrop of the mid-'80s, a few years removed from the Iranian hostage crisis that dominated the last 2 years of President Carter's presidency, and you have the Soviet Union being represented by Nikolai Volkov at the height of the Cold War during the 80s. This was an incredibly hot heel tag team, and to put the belts on them here over these kind of white meat all-American baby faces was a genius idea. Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik are a great tag team. One of my favorite tag teams of all time, in that top 10, top 15 maybe. They're not in LOD territory, but man, they could get some heat, and man, did they ever. In terms of other stuff on this card, you had Junkyard Dog taking on Greg the Hammer Valentine in an Intercontinental title match. Even though Santana was feuding with him at the time, they found a way to get JYD on the card because, frankly, he was the most over black babyface, I think, in the United States at the time, and he was one of the most over babyfaces in the WWF at the time. And JYD and Greg Valentine ended up having a very intense personal piece of business that I always love going back and watching, minus Greg the Hammer's kind of racist stuff that he said from time to time. One kind of meshing of old school and new school was David Sammartino versus Brutus Beefcake, who later became Brutus the Barber Beefcake, but at this time he was with Luscious Johnny Valiant, and of course in David Sammartino's corner was Bruno Sammartino. I always feel this was more of an attempt just to get Bruno on the card as much as anything else. Because when you got Johnny V body slamming David Sammartino, that's not really something that you say that you do when you want to build somebody into a new star. I always thought that was what they were doing here. Your two real featured matches on this card, though, were the $15,000 body slam challenge match between Big John Studd and Andre the Giant, and then, of course, the main event tag. As far as Big John Studd and Andre the Giant, Vince McMahon was always a mark and still is for the huge guys. But at this time, you've got Big John Studd, somebody you could actually look at and see giving a challenge and giving a problem to Andre the Giant. And the whole story of this, obviously, was that if he did body slam Big John Studd, Andre would get $15,000. If he failed to do that and Big John Studd body slammed Andre the Giant, then Andre the Giant would retire from professional wrestling. Now, I don't think going into it anybody actually believed that would happen, but it didn't matter. It still made for an entertaining match. Now, the younger crowd, the crowd that's into athleticism in their matches, is not going to like this match at all. But this match still did tell a story. If you like storytelling, this match did tell a story. Yes, it did. Two giants trying to establish who is the real giant, who is the biggest powerhouse in the WWF at that time. Of course, Andre wins, so as a little kid, it gives me a mark-out moment. And then afterwards, I love how Andre takes that gym bag filled with $1 bills and tries to start throwing it out in the crowd. And Bobby Heenan's like, no, give it back, give it back. 2 years later, they'd be main eventing WrestleMania 3 together. How about that? But we get to the main event tag, and that's Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff with Ace Cowboy Bob Orton in the corner versus Hulk Hogan and Mr. T with Superfly Jimmy Snuka in his corner. I always wonder if Snuka was kept out of this event because of what happened with his girlfriend a little while before this, about a year and a half before. You'll probably hear some more about this coming from the state of Maryland down the road. I believe they've reopened the investigation, getting a grand jury involved, because it's not good. And I always wonder if this was partially punishment for Snook on this, because a couple of years ago he was a top guy in this territory, and now he's in the corner, not actually wrestling in the main event. You always wonder if maybe this should have been a six-man tag or not, but it is what it is. Now, as far as the match itself, this is one of these examples here where you've got Mr. T involved in the match. So the people in part came to see T, and in part they came to see T get some measure of revenge against Roddy Piper. Now, I know Piper's always said his piece about it in terms of he kept it amateur, and he didn't want Mr. T to sit there and make the event look like a joke. He wanted to protect the business, and I get all of that. And I still think this match came across very well. It was one of those things where you had Mr. T help bring eyeballs to your television, to the televisions, to the theaters to watch it on closed circuit. And then you put the ball in the court of the person that was going to be your franchise piece for years to come. You let Hogan send them home happy. And that's exactly what happened here. This actually was an okay, solid tag match. But more importantly, it represents so much more. It's not just about professional wrestling. When you bring in people like hammered-ass Billy Martin to be your guest ring announcer, you bring in Liberace to be your guest timekeeper, when you bring in Muhammad Ali to be your special guest enforcer, even though he was originally supposed to be the referee, they couldn't trust him in that role. So Pat Patterson said, baby, I'm going to go book out there and get myself a payout. And yeah, it's all these type of things. When you bring all these people in, you bring in a Billy Martin there in New York for the Yankees fans, the Madison Square Garden crowd to cheer for. You bring in a Liberace. Liberace doing that line kick with the Rockettes was a huge deal. It might not seem like much now, but in the 80s, you just didn't see that type of stuff. And then when you bring in one of the most famous people in the entire world, Muhammad Ali, to be a part of your event in any way, shape, or form, you've got a whole new audience that you never could have envisioned for professional wrestling. And ultimately, the WWF, from this moment on, never really looked back. It changed the game. When you go on closed circuit television, which is what they did here, and people had to go to movie theaters to watch this, and over 1 million people do that, This event becomes a rousing success, along with the 19+ thousand people that paid premium ticket prices to get into this event on March 31st, 1985. I'm sure the Pittsburgh crowd wasn't very happy when their feed went out, but they ended up making right and broadcasting it on the local television affiliate there in Pittsburgh a couple of weeks later, the entire show. WrestleMania 1 is obviously one of those seminal events in WWF/WWE history. To me, because of what the WWF had on the line at the time, because what Vince McMahon was trying to do, the risk involved with if it didn't work, all the publicity that this company was generating from the Rocket Wrestling Connection, along with the negative stuff that was coming from the John Stossel, Dr. D 2020 crap, and Hulk Hogan and Mr. T and the Richard Belzer show. There were so many things on the line, so many things that could have went wrong here. And ultimately, if it would have went wrong, Vince and the WWF might have eventually ceased to exist. There's no question about it. I think to give this show a grade anything other than an A plus is a grave, grave injustice. Certain times, especially when we have the proper historical context to be able to go back and look at something through the scope of history, sometimes it's about more than just the show. You look at what led up to it. You look at what actually happened. What was the result of it? And to me, WrestleMania 1 is one of the greatest WrestleMania shows of all time. Not because of the actual in ring stuff. Again, like I said, it's because of its significance, it's because of its meaning. Without that WrestleMania 1, you don't have WrestleMania 30 coming up next month in New Orleans. Think about it. You go from WrestleMania 1 at Madison Square Garden to now every year Vince can legitimately sell out 60, 70, 80,000 seat stadiums. But it had to start somewhere. And Roddy Piper was a top heel in the business at that time. Hulk Hogan was the top babyface in the business at the time. You bring in Mr. T, one of the biggest stars on television at the time. Cyndi Lauper, one of the hottest musicians at the time. You bring all these different elements in, and you make magic, and you make history. And that's exactly what Vince McMahon and the WWF at that time did. If you love the history of professional wrestling and you want to understand how things came to be, you need to go back and watch WrestleMania 1 and watch when they put on the WWE Network about the WrestleMania Rewind and talk about all of this stuff. And it'll give you a great appreciation as you look forward to WrestleMania 30. And sometimes maybe we complain about this or we complain about that. We see where wrestling was almost 30 years ago and what it has evolved to and where it has become. You don't have anymore where wrestlers are walking in front of Lord Alfred Hayes right as he's trying to do interviews and right as he's trying to set up stuff to go to the next segment. There's so much that has changed and so much that has improved, and the production values have skyrocketed astronomically and so many other things. I mean, WrestleMania 1 is just one of those special events that will always hold a special place in my heart. And as a result, I have no choice but to grade it as an A plus because of what was on the line, what ended up happening, and what ended up being result.